It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is broadcast number 474, January the 4th, 1981. The first Sunday evening of the new year. This show will be titled the Mae Brussell Comedy Hour instead of the World Watchers this evening, and maybe for a few weeks later. I received a letter and a telephone call from one listener who suggested that the solution to the world problems would be to just go out on the streets and laugh. It actually is a childlike approach when matters are very serious, such as looking down the barrel of a gun. But maybe we can turn the news into some funny stories so that he gets his money's worth for this hour looking at the news from the comedy hour. I remember when Mort Saul would go to nightclubs holding the daily newspaper and read the news and turn his nightclub act into a hilarious comedy hour. And then after John Kennedy was assassinated and he found the news not very funny and really very serious, people were disappointed in Mort Saul's presentation of his humor, bringing in the assassination and other conspiracies later on. Just for laughs, the hearing of Carlos Marcello of organized crime is going to take place. His trial will begin February the 2nd in New Orleans. The joke is that he's been charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and fraud, and the real charge should be part of murdering John Kennedy and his role with organized crime and the CIA in having President Kennedy murdered. The House Select Committee of Assassinations in 1978 closed their hearings, naming Carlos Marcello and even suggesting the smoking gun going right to his door. So is it a laugh that he's being charged in New Orleans simply for racketeering and conspiracy? They have him on the wrong charges when the government spent $6 million to find out who played a part in killing John Kennedy. For some more laughs, they have Irv Davidson down there as the defendant with Carlos Marcello in this Brylab investigation. The pretrial hearings are closed hearings. The judge has ordered no press and no spectators to see Marcello and Irv Davidson. And that's pretty funny because Irv Davidson, as I've mentioned on other programs, is the connecting link of Jimmy Hoffa, organized crime, Clint Murchison, the Texas oil people, the International Pentagon, National Security Council combine that were working together to kill John Kennedy. Irv Davidson is a public relations man in Washington, D.C., and the two will get a little slap on the wrist in New Orleans, and that is pretty funny because they'll be out and nothing more will be said about it. They're too high up in government to be held on any charges. So my first prediction for 1981 is that Irv Davidson and Carlos Marcello will walk away with not enough evidence to convict them. Another funny story is a Christmas message Sirhan sent to the Kennedy family this year. He's appealed to get out of Soledad prison. He's been there a long time. He said he paid his debt to society and wished the Kennedys a happy Christmas. He was charged with murdering Senator Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles. He served his time while Thane, Cesar put those bullets in the back of Robert Kennedy's head. That's pretty funny to put the wrong guy in there all of this time. Now, various people in the Middle East have suggested that Sirhan be released so, in quotes, he can teach in the various Arab schools and universities as soon as he leaves Soledad in California. So that's pretty funny to see Sirhan, the professor, after he has been educated with the California school system, to teach university over in the Middle East. We'll try to keep this funny, but it isn't really very hilarious yet. Iran warned Reagan today on the radio from Tehran, "You better not mess around with the hostages or us." In quotes, Reagan and his colleagues should learn their lesson from Carter's fate. Reagan's threat will fail to browbeat the Muslims of Iran. They will rather have the opposite effect, and if Ronald Reagan goes ahead with his aggressive policies, they might result in the crippling of the Western economy and the destruction of oil wells in the Middle East, which are the lifeline of Western economy. Reagan had better act with restraint. Now, that's pretty funny. That was the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle this morning, a syndicated story, of course, from the UPI, and the important point being with all the bravado that he has behind him and all the muscle and all Lockheed and Pentagon and Bell Helicopter and Boeing and all the men who make the ammunitions for war, the fact is that there are kamikaze troops trained in Uganda, Libya, Syria, all over the Middle East, Iran, that will blow up every oil well in the Middle East. So they didn't say they'd blow up the wells in Iran. They said the Middle East. So Reagan is going to be immobilized, just as Jimmy Carter was, and if he makes one bad move, the laugh will be on us. The oil that we have would be used for airplanes or for hospital ships or transportation. And it could be in the near future that the United States will be cut off from each other. People in New York will not get to California or back and forth to the East Coast or to the islands, Hawaii or Europe or whatever. If the military oil is cut off, if Reagan makes one bad move, we will be isolated, just as people in France were cut off from Italy or Switzerland during World War II, only it will be worse, because to destroy the oil in the Middle East is a very easy thing to do, given the weapons that they have now and the intent, and they made that clear. An article in the answering this back in the Chronicle by William Randolph Hearst Jr., a chip off the daddy's old block. He has a story from San Simeon, the Hearst Castle, saying, cut Iran's lifeline. Randolph Hearst paraded Goebbels and Goering and Adolf Hitler and Mussolini in the Hearst newspapers. He built them up as the great heroes of the world. Their escapade cost the European countries their freedom. Russia could move right into Germany, right as far as West Germany. The whole world was disrupted by deaths and refugees and debts of war. The Hearsts love these little wars. They sell newspapers. But what guarantee does William Randolph Hearst have that when you cut Iran's lifeline, it stops with Iran? It doesn't stop there. And these people fouled everything up through World War I and II. They want World War III. Their expertise has brought nothing but inflation, high prices, waste, defoliation, pollution, insanity, depression and inflation and unemployment. The Western worlds that have been geared for this warfare mechanic, such as Brazil, Argentina, South America, I mentioned them before, Great Britain, United States, are economically bankrupt, and yet a man like Hearst is egging the Reagan people on from California to cut Iran's lifeline, and he can't give us a signed guarantee that it will stop with Iran. Now, in the next few weeks, there are subjects in the news that I'm going to go to in detail, but I want to cover a few articles that are primary of importance, and I'm going to get back to these, but I have received articles and books and calls from various listeners, and I want to mention these subjects that have been in the news the last few weeks because we were doing the three-part series on John Lennon's murder, and I'll get back to them. One is the movie The Formula, and also the book that was sent to me by one of my subscribers. The movie The Formula is an interesting picture, and be sure to see it, and then I will discuss with you parts of the book and the movie that I think that are significant. The chief of police is murdered in the movie and in the book. The chief of police of Beverly Hills, who is linked to the oil companies, is the one that I've mentioned on other radio tapes and broadcasts for years. That's Jack Eggers. He actually wasn't murdered, but he was almost murdered with a contract of somebody from Argentina. Jack Eggers was the police chief of Beverly Hills who worked with Bobby Hall and Robert Vesco that supplied the narcotics that kept Howard Hughes drugged until he was kidnapped in 1966 and taken from the Beverly Hills Hotel. The chief of police in Beverly Hills did work with the assassination teams, with the narcotics, gun running. The same people who were doping the rock musicians, Bobby Hall, was asked to investigate by the managers who was giving drugs to their artists. The Formula has a basis of truth in it. Also, the movie was made by MGM, and I'm going to share with you an article about various oil companies, Shell Oil, Mobil Oil, and Atlantic Richfield. Mobil, of course, being Standard. They were angry about the film. It seems it came out without their knowing about it until it was just about completed. And right after MGM produced the movie and it was in the can and ready to go, the MGM hotel burnt down in Las Vegas. I believed at the time that it went down too fast and the towers, the alarm systems were cut off, and I believed that a good suspect would be that arson had set that fire. And I'll share articles about Kirk Kerkorian's dream ending. He wanted to buy Columbia Studio. They're bankrupt with the MGM case and so forth. I believe that the burning of the hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada, of the MGM hotel that will affect their investments in Atlantic City has to do with the fact of the formula being made. Another section of articles I'm going to share with you have to do with Jonestown. Jack Anderson has been coming out with some dynamite articles again lately. He lays dormant for a while and then comes out with bombshells. He had an article just last week on the Angola, CIA involvement in Angola, and Philip Blakey of Jonestown, one of the assassins of the large number of people murdered. Philip Blakey left on the yacht that belonged to Jim Jones. He's still at large, and he worked for the CIA in Angola, as did other people from Jonestown. And the airport that they left from was the Georgetown Airport in South America. Another article I want to go into, several articles, is Robert Vesco. There were rumors he left the Bahamas. Today he said he hadn't left the Bahamas. Vesco is a character in the book The Formula, Mr. Vedesco, and he's one of the most important people like Carlos Marcello floating around. The only reason he isn't murdered up to this date, I guess, is because he probably has secreted away all of his documents and evidence. He worked with Mr. Casey, a member of the Reagan cabinet. He's now in the cabinet. He's worked with the top-level government people. He is one of the connecting links, higher than Marcello even, between the CIA and organized crime and the Defense Department. He floats around on his yachts and planes. Allegedly, he's supposed to leave the Bahamas, but he'll probably go to Libya to join Frank Turple and George Corcola if he isn't murdered before then. There are some more articles. Jack Anderson had one this week on Afghanistan and the growing of opium poppies being the principal crop in Afghanistan and how the Soviet Union curtailed production. Those of you who are familiar with my research and my radio programs have said that the reason Jimmy Carter was so angry about the Russians invading Afghanistan wasn't that they interrupted the life expectancy, the production, the economy. It wasn't a fruitful economy. The life expectancy there's about 37. The women are kept in slavery. It's run by tribes whose main production is opium, and there was a traffic through the Middle East that the Georgia Mafia and a group of people were enjoying that went through Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Turkey and was flooding Europe with the narcotics. And when the Soviet Union came down and took their paws and took Afghanistan, it interrupted the poppy growth, which sends these people in a tizzy because we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of profit in their pocket. And this is what the reason I think Carter was so angry about Soviet Union going into Afghanistan. It was more logical that they overthrow Afghanistan than the CIA kill Allende to put Pinochet into power way over in Chile, which hardly is a border next to the United States. The question of Afghanistan has been a question of narcotic war, and Jack Anderson has an article on that today. Also, there are articles about Portugal and the recent murder of Sa Carneiro. Richard Allen on Ronald Reagan's team was a lobbyist for Portugal. With the CIA, he denied certain massacres that were taking place. He's very much involved with Portugal, and they had a political murder last week. I want to do more on that. And finally, in a few weeks, I want to get specifically just one program about Alexander Haig. I've promised to update the work I did last year or the year before on Alternative 3. Those are the space colonies that are being built to, in quotes, siphon off the Earth's population. I called Louise Kaplan, the co-author of that book, The Doomsday Dictionary. I called her New York this week because that book was published in 1963, and in it they had such wonderful insight into things that were happening now that I learned about in the last few years, but they were publishing in 1963, and one of them was the space stations to siphon our population off. And I asked her where she got this, and she said from Albert Kahn's book from the Congressional Record. In the 60s, they were talking about building space colonies. The New York Times has a long article, December the 5th, just this past December the 5th, on United Technologies. That's the company that General Haig is the president of, that is making the construction for the space stations. He's very much involved with the L5 Society, with Barry Goldwater, with the secret moon treaties that other countries can't inspect the space stations when they're built. Alexander Haig has worked with Nazi scientists, with American technology, and our Secretary of State is now president of United Technology and has been trying to do away with the moon treaty and the inspection of these places. After Auschwitz and Dachau and the concentration camps in Germany, we should never allow secret defense establishments or housing facilities to be secret any longer. We should always be aware of slave labor, which is taking place in the Middle East today and in Africa, but we should be particularly aware of those scientists who worked at Pundament or Dora or in Europe with concentration camp slave labor, who are alive today and who are building these stations. Those will be programs that I will be doing in the future in much greater detail, but I want you to know that articles are coming out and that I'm saving them and have enough material now, but not enough time. I want to do a few more comments about musicians, not on John Lennon specifically, but just a few more follow-ups, and we'll be doing more on the motives and the government operations to do away with the musicians. There's an article this November in the New York Daily News, one of my listeners sent to me, called "Evel Younger from the Wild West is Heading for the Capitol Role." And the article says, so look who's heading the Ronald Reagan Task Force on Law and Order. Evel Younger, California Attorney General. Younger, as the Attorney General under Governor Ronald Reagan, reported the comings and goings of political activists such as Jane Fonda, Joan Baez, Tom Hayden, Cesar Chavez, the Jewish Defense League, the Black Panthers, and music fans who attended rock concerts. It wasn't enough to know who the artists were, but the people who attended. They put this into computers that went into data banks from the Los Angeles Police Department into Utah. I've done many shows on Evel Younger, and we'll do more later. Another article, "The Kitchen Cabinet Hails a Chief." This is from the LA Times, and it's an article about Mr. Meese, the head of Reagan's cabinet, being honored, and it's a National Education Institute and a group called Law at Work, and photographed with him as Mr. and Mrs. Evel Younger. Evel Younger is a general in the Army. He's a retired FBI man. And if one single man worked along with Ronald Reagan in the terrorism in California, this Younger is the guy to nail. If you want to do research on Younger, go to your library and look up everything you can under his name and begin putting it together, because he will be appointed as a justice of the Supreme Court or director of the FBI, and then heaven help us. You can look up stories on the Manson family, on the Robert Kennedy assassination, on George Jackson murder, the Glass House tapes by Louis Tackwood. There are endless books. Younger's team and Ed Davis of the Criminal Conspiracy Section in Los Angeles manipulated a spate of murders and shootouts, and the purpose was to discredit the blacks, the United Prisoners Union, the Black Panthers, and the gay liberation, you name it, the American Indian movement, everything that was liberal or anti-war particularly, or again the rock concerts, was bugged and followed and reported, the people who were interested in these activities. Another article in the Star that you get on the counters of the grocery stores and drugstores, John Lennon's Secret Affair. This is an article about his falling in love with a woman for 18 months And it ended in 1975 when Yoko suggested that John go to a hypnotist and get over this crazy thing that he was doing. So she set up the appointment, and after his first session with the hypnotist, John, spellbound, went back to Yoko and never saw Mae Pang again. I could say more on this. Those of you who know my suspicious mind can draw conclusions, and I'll do more on this subject later. One other thing, Jackie Onassis assisted Yoko Ono in getting John's son Julian to come to the United States right after John was murdered. I talked about odd couples last week. The oddest couple of all are Jackie Onassis and Yoko Ono, and I could just about give 30 parallels of the Lennon murder to the Kennedy assassination. One of the people who subscribes to my tapes in Santa Barbara sent me a copy of an article he wrote in 1979 on the FBI investigation of Jimi Hendrix. That's one of the rock musicians who was making concerts for the anti-war movement in 1969. He had a concert for the Chicago conspiracy trial in April 25th of 1969. He was helping Tom Hayden and Abby Hoffman and those people against the war, the Vietnam War, in 1968, and giving benefit concerts. So the FBI made out documents on Jimi Hendrix, and under the Executive Order 11652, in the interest of national defense and foreign policy, they have many files, many lines are blocked out, and they started an information file 163 on Hendrix, but they don't explain in the FBI documents what 163 is. But there were national security reasons, and they had a security index on Jimi Hendrix, not for any police records, but the security index the FBI had is a master warrant for thousands of Americans who the FBI calls subversive, who would be rounded up and put in concentration camps in the event of a national emergency, and Jimi Hendrix was one of those. He was going to the New Mobe anti-war march to play. He played November the 11th, 1969. In Washington, D.C., Jimi Hendrix was mentioned that he was scheduled to appear. This was in the FBI files in 1969, and in 1970, Jimi Hendrix was dead. He died in London, allegedly over some vomit in his sleep. But the person who wrote this article, Merv Glass, along with John Raymond, noted that Fred Hampton in Chicago was drugged by an FBI man before they broke in the place and gunned him down. The FBI man said that they drugged him so that he wouldn't resist, so that he was given by his so-called best friend drugs, and then he fell asleep, and then the FBI came in and murdered Fred Hampton and Mark Clark Wright in Chicago, and the FBI had many reasons for murdering them, and there have been lawsuits on that. Jimi Hendrix was under surveillance of the FBI, and Merv Glass has these documents, and so was Janis Joplin and many other rock musicians, along with Ebel Younger's file of those who attended the concerts. Another article this week, Christian music is suddenly big business. It goes into Donna Summers, Bob Dylan, Al Green, B.J. Thomas, and various musicians. They have a large number of albums. There's approximately 15 Christian album makers right now. There's Christian radio stations. ABC Network has their own Christian record company. MCA Universal has their Christian record company. They have charts for white contemporary Christian music or the black gospel Christian music. Even in religious terms, they're separated. There's 7,000 radio stations in America. 1,400 are playing the Christian music right now. That would be another reason for wiping out all of these anti-war musicians or people working for peace and bring on the Christian music, and let's get off to war. Gary Paxton, a songwriter and producer, was shot in Nashville. Somebody came to his door, two men who wanted help with a tire. He went outside, and he was in a scuffle with these people. One of the men who tried to kill him was from Hampton, Georgia. Last time I read about him this week, it was just the 2nd of January, Gary Paxton was in intensive care. And Tim Hardin, the protege of Bobby Darin, the folk singer, he wrote in the late 60s. Tim Hardin died this week I have no follow-up of what he died from. He died in Los Angeles. I read that they were going to do an autopsy on him. The conclusions have not been published. He wrote If I Were a Carpenter and other songs. They weren't very controversial, but I understand he just cut a new record with one of the bigger record companies. But like the other musicians who've died on the eve of their new big possible successes, Tim Hardin died last week. Ronald Reagan is very much linked up with the Reverend Moon organization, and now I'm going to jump away from musicians to Christians again, because along the line of Christian music, I want to mention the influence of Rev Moon on Ronald Reagan and the new administration that is pushing for Christian government. I'll list some of the things they want in terms of Christian government. There were 3 articles in the paper this week. One, Bohemian Club Flack. This was about a dinner to honor the president of the Moon organization, the Unitarian Church. The Bohemian Club was to give the honors and the invitation, and the invitations were actually sent out from the Unification Church in Berkeley. So they had to quickly change and have it at the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco. The invitations came from the American Council for the International Promotion of Democracy Under God, run by the Mooney organizations. Members of the American Council for International Promotion of Democracy Under God, along with the Moon organization, are such people as Henry Luce III, Vice President of Time and Life, Claire Giannini Hoffman, Vice President of Bank of America, John Volpe, former Massachusetts governor, and it's a New York-based organization of wealthy, prominent citizens who also help support Catholic University in Rome. Another article from New York Magazine, ex-Mooney is running the Heritage Foundation. Michael Borden, who worked his way up in the Mooney organization from 1969 to 1980, is now official head of the Heritage Foundation, which is the domestic advisor to Ronald Reagan, the Washington think tank. Another article in the Los Angeles Times, the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, moves into the Capitol to influence Reagan's administration. This is an LA Times article last week. Among the things they want to do, this Christian Mooney Heritage Foundation, is unleash the CIA, increase defense spending, use food as a foreign policy weapon, restore Congressional Internal Security Committee, roll back federal programs for minorities, curtail the federal regulatory agencies such as Clean Air or Occupational Safety, cut taxes, and cut all non-defense spending. Now, that is right from the Heritage Foundation, run by the Mooney organization that is very much supported, the American Council for the International Promotion of Democracy Under God. There are very reasonable people pushing for these programs. And finally, there was an article in the paper today, Reverend Moon is Cupid for 843 couples in New York. He's matched 1,600 persons who never met each other. They come from faraway places like Canada and Australia. They're going to have a wedding day ceremony soon for 10,000 couples that Reverend Moon has fixed up. And they said in the newspaper they prefer to have their church founder suggest the match who they marry. We consider it a privilege to be involved in such a large ceremony. Now, you talk about mind control. Reverend Moon made gunpowder in South Korea. He was linked to money directly from Adolf Hitler. He is in this country with huge non-profit organizations, newspapers, fisheries, and industries because it's a church. He doesn't pay American taxes, and he's going to marry 10,000 couples that he designated should mate each other, and each of them accepts that as a privilege. Now, that's pretty funny. That's the first half of the Mae Brussell Comedy Hour. We're going to take a 60-second break, 1 minute to stop laughing, and then we'll get back to the second half of this program.
International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Doing the Comedy Hour, and I hope my friend is getting one laugh a minute, because can you imagine when those 10,000 Moonies procreate and we have 50,000 little Moonies, parents selected by Reverend Moon, and then they go out and have 4 or 5 more? It's going to be pretty funny. That is pretty funny that people this day and age will go to him and let him say, this is your new partner, and they will take the advice and have mass wedding ceremonies and go out and serve the Lord according to Reverend Moon. Well, we're going to jump now to some more laughs. Kennedy assassination is always in the news, and that's pretty funny because the Warren Commission and Earl Warren and J. Edgar Hoover thought that they could end the story of the Kennedy assassination very quickly. All they had to say within an hour was Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone, and you were supposed to believe that. When Lyndon Johnson was on Air Force One coming back to Washington, D.C., he was told from the White House, we have the assassin, it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and no conspiracy. Well, it is pretty funny that after 17 years, there isn't hardly a day that goes by in the newspaper that there isn't information and more stories about the Kennedy assassination. And again, Jack Anderson was coming through this week. He was into the Angola CIA, he was into the Afghanistan opium, a poppy crop cut off by the Russians, and he's had a lot of good articles. Another one he had this week, he talks about the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and he said that they were blaming, the FBI was blaming the acoustics for being in error, that actually there were only a certain amount of shots at Dealey Plaza, and Lee Harvey Oswald did them, and there was no other gunman at the grassy knoll. But along comes Anderson, and then he says, the FBI claims that the House Committee does not prove that the recorded sounds came from the assassination scene. Yet a transcript of the Dallas Police Dispatch's radio transmission makes it clear the sounds were from the Dealey Plaza area, which would support the researchers' allegations based upon the ballistic evidence, the clothing, and the bullets, and the position of John Kennedy's head when it was blown off, etc., and where the assassin was sounding, the sounds they heard, and where people ran to the hill. It's 17 years later, and the good old boy, Jack Anderson, is changing sides now and saying it is clear the sounds were from the Dealey Plaza area and not where the prestigious Warren Commission said from the Texas School Book Depository building. Now, the FBI's insistence, according to Jack Anderson, was that no conspiracy was involved. And this idea, he said, stemmed from a memo sent by Director J. Edgar Hoover sent to President Johnson in his office 2 days after John Kennedy was murdered. And this is what Hoover wrote. The thing I'm concerned about is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin, just as they convinced the public that Sirhan was the real assassin of Robert Kennedy when it was Thane Cesar. They would like to convince the public. But the important thing about this article, written December 29th, 1980, is that 17 years later, tomorrow, the people who were born in 1962, 1 year before John Kennedy was assassinated, must go to their post office and sign up for a draft. And the chances are that generation is going to go to war. That was 1 year before John Kennedy was killed. We've been working at this to illustrate that there was a military takeover and that the purpose of killing John Kennedy was to escalate those wars for which you will register tomorrow if you were born in 1962. If we had the cooperation of your congressmen and your assemblymen and your mothers and fathers and priests and rabbis, you might be spared the war that you're facing. But for 17 years, a handful of people have stood here and dug up the facts, and if we didn't do it, Jack Anderson wouldn't print it now. But the fact is that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't kill anybody, and you're going to register for a war that isn't necessary, and we will never win. There's no way we can win it, but you're going out as cannon fodder to fight their war. If you clean up the mess at home, you won't have to go fight it over there. And if you don't clean it up here, you're going to fight it there. In other articles in the past weeks, file on Oswald rifled, the FBI agent says. I'm going into these later on the Kennedy assassination and update the details for you, but James Hosty, an FBI man that worked with Marina Oswald and Ruth Payne, women working with the Defense Department and Navy intelligence. Hosty worked with Lee Harvey Oswald, worked with those wives at the house where Oswald stayed on his weekends. He met with them twice before the assassination. They were making their deals and plans for the cover-up and also for the possible getaway of Lee Harvey Oswald when that poor double would be gunned down and later the grave would be emptied out, and they don't dare open that up. A lawsuit still pending on that. Another large article by Earl Goltz that I'll share with you, Hoover's vendetta targeted the Dallas police. J. Edgar Hoover was so angry at comments that the Dallas police made right after the assassination that they were familiar with Lee Harvey Oswald's activities, that they weren't invited to the police academy, the FBI academy, for 2 years. He ignored them and was furious because of the controversies that rose up and had an official boycott of the city police officers of all of Dallas after they gave a statement that they knew Oswald was capable of committing the assassination. Oswald wasn't capable and hadn't fired a gun, but what they made it look like was that the FBI knew that he could do it and goofed, and Hoover didn't want that, and besides that, it brought more controversy than if it had just been this lone nut that the FBI didn't know about in advance. Hoover was worrying about the fact, as he said to Lyndon Johnson, that people would worry and not think Oswald did it. And as soon as the FBI said, oh, we knew who he was and he was capable of it, that meant that they weren't doing their work, and Hoover was furious. James Hosty, the gentleman who worked with Lee Oswald's wife and with Ruth Payne, as I say, of the Defense Department, he surfaced after 17 years to try to bring in a Lee Harvey Oswald Russian spy story again, as if we knew he was a Russian spy, but they kept information from me and took it from my desk. And I will go in, as I say, into the details of this also later with you, but I want you to watch the articles on the Kennedy assassination and realize that the Robert Kennedy story, the Martin Luther King, the John Kennedy assassination items are still very much in the news and always will be until the full truth is told. There was an important series of articles on Nazi developments, and I have to interweave these weekly or very often, the Nazi stories with the assassination research, because as I got farther into my research, the people involved in killing John Kennedy, members of organized crime, the Defense Department, the FBI, were working with Nazi assassination teams in Mexico and in South America. Kennedy was offed by a team of gun running, narcotic traffic, Nazi connections that all interweave, and wherever you go, new evidence is coming up linking these connections throughout the country to South America, Switzerland, Swiss banks, and the assassination teams. Now, I refer to the military coup that took place November 22nd, 1963, when John Kennedy was murdered. Kennedy was elected, and then he was murdered, and the military took over all decisions of the government and maneuvered the presidents from that point on. In Germany, Adolf Hitler was elected president of Germany. He came in on an election just as Ronald Reagan has come in on an election. And right after he was elected, there was that famous Reichstag fire that I've referred to many, many times that took place February 27th, 1933. Well, at the time of the Reichstag fire, that Reichstag is the government building in Germany, similar to our White House in Washington, D.C. Adolf Hitler used that as an excuse to round up all labor organizers, all social workers, all people against Nazism. And the excuse was that a gentleman named van der Lubbe, L-U-B-B-E, Martinus van der Lubbe, was a communist and that he had set fire to the Reichstag. Well, this last week, December the 30th, 1980, the verdict was cleared. Martinus van der Lubbe had been beheaded by Adolf Hitler in April 1934. And now the story is reversed, and they said that there was a tunnel linked from the Reichstag to Hermann Goering's residence. There were burn marks made by torches going into the building, that they beheaded this gentleman as an excuse to round up the radicals and put them all in prison and start the reign of terror in Nazi Germany. And the brother of this gentleman had asked for this trial or the hearing to be opened up, and the verdict was cleared, and he was acquitted last week posthumously of having started the fire. The article in the New York Times and also the San Francisco Chronicle said the new decision doesn't address itself as to who did set the Reichstag fire, but in the past years since 1934, it's been generally agreed and pretty well documented, even this article, that Goering and Adolf Hitler set it themselves to round up the radicals. Now, I mention this because Ronald Reagan works with those very people who set up this Reichstag fire and that kind of operation. So what you can expect from schools of sabotage, there's 5 of them in Texas, they're all over the country. You're going to see buildings burnt, train stations bombed, collisions of trains, airplanes falling, so-called kidnappings. There are going to be a series of murders, the kind that they used in Germany to get the emotions of people so aroused that they will beg for the police to take control. There was what they called the senseless, motiveless murder of a couple at Davidson, the university up there. There was a senseless murder of a man leaving a disco dance place at 5 in the morning in Oakland. Motiveless crimes. We have a series of murders up at Mount Tamalpais. This country is going to see a rash of sabotage because they're being trained, according to newspaper articles, for this kind of thing. And the only purpose of this, the only purpose it used in Russia when the czars were there for terror, or in Germany or in Italy, is to give power to the police because people are totally helpless, and the only solution they can have to various acts of sabotage is the use of the police. So the only way to counteract this kind of violence is to investigate every so-called motiveless crime or every act of destruction and get to the source of it. This last week, a general died, an admiral, Nazi Grand Admiral Karl Donitz. He is a name that many of you don't know if you don't read the newspapers or study history, and many of you know him. He was 89 years old, an interesting age because I have maintained that Adolf Hitler is 89 years old and could be located today. Donitz was his buddy. Hitler managed to squeeze away. I believe that can be carefully documented. And he gave the government to Donitz at the last minute for 23 days. So in April 1945, Donitz took care of the German government. He was a member of the Nazi Party from its very beginning. And in May of 1945, he wanted the Nazis to quickly surrender so that he could lead them on to the peace agreements. He claims that the Bolsheviks were always a danger, that he was serving the best interests of Germany. And he served about 10 years in prison. He was released by John J. McCloy, who was later on the Warren Commission and High Commissioner of Germany. McCloy representing Chase Manhattan and Rockefeller interests and various multinationals, released almost all the Nazis after 10 years in prison. Donitz bragged about the fact that he sunk 14 million tons of Allied shipping material, 52,000 tons the last 5 weeks of the war. He killed approximately 100,000 British merchant seamen. They lost their lives just in the Battle of the Atlantic. He was a great Navy person who killed many, many allies into the hundreds of thousands. He had what you call the Atlantic wolf packs, and he had tremendous Navy force to sink U-boats and so forth. So Donitz died this last week, age 89, which was a ripe old age, a lot longer than John Lennon lived, and he lived a very quiet, prosperous life in Germany. He was just in the hospital in the last 4 weeks before he finally succumbed, but it was a full life. And no matter what his war crimes were, the Allies felt kindly towards him, and 10 years they felt was enough time for him to serve. There are articles this week. Another Nazi is going to either surface or commit suicide. Simon Wiesenthal has finally gotten off his butt and says he has information about Joseph Mengele, the angel of death at Auschwitz. I've done radio broadcasts that Mengele was an American citizen. At the time he experimented at Auschwitz. He lived in Germany quite comfortably after the war. He was never wanted at Nuremberg as a war criminal. He went to South America. According to the news stories now, there is a $50,000 reward for his arrest. There also was an article out of Tel Aviv saying that Simon Wiesenthal, the known Nazi hunter, thinks Mengele will either surface or commit suicide. And he says we have common acquaintances with him, the Israeli intelligence in Wiesenthal, and that he is preparing his defense. I spoke with a gentleman who lives in Sacramento who obtained for me the FBI documents on Mengele being an American citizen, and told me about a relative of his who is an associate of Mengele. And he called me this last week because I thought he was talking about the news articles of Mengele surfacing. He has hundreds of articles from the National Archives, not articles, but documents, on the aliases of Mengele and his whereabouts. And as I said, I thought he was going to confirm the catch that Wiesenthal is making. He told me that these stories in the news are fabricated and that probably the Mengele they get will be cremated or will commit suicide. He said that he's absolutely positive that the man, he used Enderman, he used a lot of aliases. The documents say recently 9 different aliases he's used. This person told me that he's living right now in Nevada City in California, that he saw him and had coffee with him and his wife. Mengele was married in 1936, and that they're living in Nevada City, and that he feels he's sure that this is the man that worked with his uncle in Oakland during the war and was involved with Nazi operations because he was familiar with them before. He said the South American story is a lot of baloney, that he wouldn't stay down there in those hot deserts and not deserts, in the jungles of Paraguay, and that he feels that Mengele is not there at all, that if they pull him in, he'll be very much surprised because a man closely resembling him with the same accent and the same so-called wife or the family that he knew is currently in Nevada City. So Wiesenthal, who wrote the book, no, he didn't write the book, Boys from Brazil by Levin, was about Mengele and his experiments, and Wiesenthal wants to close in on him, but time will tell. Another book coming out interesting, there's a lot of good books right now. This is a small publication, a book debunking the story of Admiral Byrd. And this goes again into Adolf Hitler's possible escape and donuts and the Nazi operations. This book is about a man who went down to Antarctic with Rear Admiral Byrd. He said he was vain, mystical, egocentric, and that he was built up by a political machine in Virginia. And he claims that he was the political admiral who took advantage of his brother's position in the Senate for his own ambitions. This book talks about the military explorations and has to do with State Department papers. It's called Assault on Eternity by Leslie A. Rose. And it has to do with participation in a 1956 Antarctic expedition. And there have been allegations or beliefs that Admiral Byrd knew and was familiar with the habitat of Adolf Hitler down in Antarctica. So I'm interested in this book. He goes into a thing that they called Operation High Jump, which was a massive World War II expedition that Byrd led to the Antarctic in 1946 and 1947. Now, the Byrd trip to Antarctica, all of these episodes are carefully locked up. And according to this writer, Mr. Rose, he says that the access to the papers remains guarded by the family, that Byrd had enemies, he had political connections, and that a lot of what he did and saw is locked up to this day. He also says that Drew Pearson challenged Byrd about various areas that were mapped out in Antarctica, and that Byrd had such political clout with Herbert Hoover and Roosevelt in the White House that you couldn't touch him. He also describes when Byrd came back to the Navy Yard in 1947 and met with Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who greeted him. That's interesting because I have a book on the murder of James Forrestal, that it was possibly one of the first assassinations of the government to test mind control. He was flown out of a window at Bethesda Hospital it was shortly after the Byrd expedition, one of the Byrd expeditions down there. So this book debunking Admiral Byrd's exploits, called Assault on Eternity, deals with the secrecy, with the politics, the experiences he had which are locked up, and that he was way overblown, and also with Drew Pearson challenging Byrd. It seems that Drew Pearson was into a lot of stories before he died, which would almost make one investigate, if we could, how Drew Pearson died so young. One of the big stories just prior to his death was on the homosexual ring around Ronald Reagan in Sacramento. He exposed the Nixon-Berger connections and loans that were never paid back of the Howard Hughes empire to the Richard Nixon family. And when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, he was into the people around Ronald Reagan. And I didn't realize also that Drew Pearson was checking out the facts of Admiral Byrd. So with Donitz gone, 89 years of age, and the Byrd facts still locked up and Forrestal dead, it would be interesting to get access, possibly someday, to the still secret papers to see what politics Admiral Byrd had with the Nazis, with Antarctica, and did he in fact see Adolf Hitler? There are allegations of this in some books, and it gives something to think about, realizing what happened to Forrestal. And as I say, the papers are locked up. And for those of you who said Adolf Hitler couldn't live to be 89, I repeat again that Donitz, his buddy, just died this week. Hitler was a vegetarian and had no smoking and no meats, and was in a germ-free environment. So it is very possible, given the secrecy and the installations that were going on down in Antarctica, that he did indeed live there for a long time. I mentioned a man that sponsored Colonial Dignidad. This was the headquarters for Nazi assassination teams down in Chile that are still operating. It's known as Operation Condor. There's a name that I got from Amnesty International that I wanted to share, and I don't think I had it on the radio. And if you have a pencil and you do research or you have the tapes, it's Gerhard Mertens, Gerhard Mertins. Now you researchers go out and find his name in books and articles and find as much as you can for me. He's from London. He's an arms merchant. He's as big as Samuel Cummings and the same kind of weaponry, and he sends money and financing down to Colonial Dignidad in Chile, which borders on Argentina, which has been the nesting place of the Nazis before and after and during World War II. I only have 5 minutes left, and I do want to, maybe next week, start with some of the missing millions. In the last week or so, while we've been doing the John Lennon story, there have been stories linking the Central Intelligence Agency, narcotics traffic, gun running, Libya, South America, the very same teams that I keep using over and over again. There's an article in the New York Times, January the 4th, today, a large story on an accused con man named Jack Bender, who had many, many aliases, who disappeared with approximately $60 million and left $22 million down in Paraguay. He has passports from all over the world and traveled between Hollywood and Switzerland and South America and London and Monte Carlo and so forth. Another article from the Houston Post, Houstonian buried near Bolivian crash site. This has to do with a man, Frank Jeff Dyke Jr. from Houston, Texas, a director of Gulf Resources and Chemical Corporations, member of the Young Presidents Club, a very social, wealthy man from Houston, Texas, whose airplane crashed in Bolivia, and the body was found approximately 12 miles away from the plane. The body of this person and his companion, who's the son of an aluminum company executive in Pennsylvania, their bodies were found in coffins, and the plane was on its back, and then it had been turned over and burned. Large connections to multinational corporations, strange circumstances why the plane was destroyed, and the farmer in the house had the key to the planes in his house. This plane was not registered to leave the United States. It never legally arrived in Bolivia. A lot of mystery and suggested large cocaine traffic. There was cocaine on the plane, but this would be an important link to Bolivia and Gulf and the Houston, Texas, Pennsylvania combine, and the two men were left in a coffin. Another article from Philadelphia Magazine, reprinted in the Washington Post: routine arrest leads police to the web of intrigue. This has to do with two brothers, Bradley Bryant and Larry Bryant, and in essence it has to do with another $55 million of narcotics traffic and links to the Central Intelligence Agency, to stealing of weapons from United States bases, shipping them overseas, and then exchanging them for narcotics and reshuffling that. I added up about 5 articles just in the newspaper in the last 5 days or so, and then several from 2 months ago. $50 million missing from the Howard Hughes organization until he legally died. Another 131 had been missing, 131 million. 60 million swindle of this Jack Bender. Another 22 million he left behind. This Philadelphia company involved $55 million in narcotics. The Florida marijuana arrest and 2 airplanes crashed involved another $55 million. And I mentioned on programs $55 million from the Nugan Bank in Australia, involved with the CIA and assassination teams. And Michael Sindona is still before the courts in New York for other charges linked to $45 million from the Franklin National Bank. Well, I added up these stories. There's approximately $467 million floating between assassination teams, the CIA, narcotics traffic, and gun running. Now, that is a lot of money to be reading about in a newspaper in just a 2-week period. Out of 5 or 6 articles, I totaled a $467 million floating fund, again, of Navy intelligence linked to CIA, linked to assassination teams, to South America, Libya, narcotics, and so forth. The tangled web of the Pentagon, the intelligence community, the gun runners, and the assassination teams is coming out every day in the newspapers. Save your articles, put them away, and look back years from now. It is a tangled web, but it's an interesting one. And it's lots of fun to read. This is the Comedy Hour, and you'll have a lot of fun reading about the floating 40 or 50 million missing next week. In the meantime, our time is out. We'll do more on that next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Have a funny week, and I'll be back with you for the Mae Brussell Comedy Hour.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.